And the death toll is expected to climb in the deadliest U.S. wildfire in over 100 years. The Biden administration says it's focused on finding those still missing, while outrage intensifies over failures to warn residents. NTD's Iris Tao has more from the White House.
More than 100 people have been confirmed dead. That's as specialist teams continue to search for those missing in the ruins of the Maui wildfires. And the head of FEMA told us at today's White House briefing that search efforts have been difficult.
It is extremely hazardous. Nothing can prepare you for what I saw during my time here.
And Hawaii's governor warned that the final death count could be much higher.
They will find 10 to 20 people per day probably until they finish. And it's probably going to take 10 days. It's impossible to guess, really.
The administration says it has sent hundreds of FEMA employees to help with survivors on the ground. That is working with dozens of agencies in what it calls a whole-of-government approach. But questions are mounting over why the world's largest siren system stays silent when fires quickly spread into the neighborhood. The state is launching a formal review into its emergency response, but some are also questioning a lack of comments from the president.
People of Maui, Mr. President!
But the press secretary also confirms that President Biden has no plans to travel to Hawaii as of now, though she adds that we will hear more from him in the coming days. Reporting from the White House, Iris Tao, NTD News.
Survivors of the Maui fire say that they received no warning and that the flames appeared so quickly that escape was difficult. Everything was suddenly in flames, and many found refuge in the ocean for hours while their homes burned to the ground and into the same powdery ash footprint we've seen in recent years. So far, it is estimated that nearly 1,000 people have died. Locals are worried this includes hundreds of children who were home due to school being canceled that day. Several people are reporting that the government is not only doing little to help, but they are blocking local efforts to do so and are not allowing local donations through, and that they are blocking life-saving medicine because it isn't federally approved.
Denying people access to bring in supplies, just supplies for people to live.
The government withholding every single one of our donations because we are not a part of FEMA and Red Cross. So none of this is eligible for giving out. Tell me why. I have no freaking clue.
The people of Maui are on their own for now. And aside from the federal government's bureaucratic failure, they have good reason to be suspicious. Just like what we saw 5 years ago in Paradise, California, there was nothing normal about these fires. Within a day of burning, it was like a bomb went off.
When you see the full extent of the destruction of Lahaina, it will shock you. It does appear like a bomb and fire went off, if I may. And all of those buildings virtually are going to have to be rebuilt. It will be a new Lahaina.
Local residents have been reporting bright flashes of light. One was captured by a home security camera that appears to have been the start of the Olinda fire. Many people are saying that it was directed energy weapons. We know that most major governments already have them, and during the California fires, online weather maps recorded what looks like a laser from above, striking an area just before it bursts into flames. In his research, Dennis Mills discovered that the incendiary aluminum and barium nanodust from chemtrails is most likely fueling the ferocity of today's so-called super wildfires. And on the day before the Maui fires broke out, locals were reporting a heavy overcast from chemtrailing that they'd never seen before. It's also interesting to note that the Maui police chief was the incident commander for the Las Vegas mass shooting in 2017. Lahaina is considered to be a historic and sacred land. It was the capital of the Kingdom of Hawaii before it was taken by the United States. It's been occupied by native Hawaiians ever since, who are defiantly opposed to the mainland outsiders who have been buying up land with no respect for local culture. Not just BlackRock and Vanguard, but billionaires like Mark Zuckerberg, who owns more land on Kauai than what the government of Kauai owns. and Oprah Winfrey, who has bought over 1,000 acres of land in Hawaii, including a new 870 acres in Maui she just bought this spring. In 2018, the Paradise wildfires broke out exactly where the United Nations have plans to somehow make off-limits to humans. And that same year, a report on wildfire prevention was published that was focused on the exact same areas in Maui where the fires just broke out.
All the historic downtown, all of it is demolished and all the houses gone. But those commercial big box stores are still there.
Hawaii Governor Josh Green has been putting the World Economic Forum's Great Reset agenda ahead of Hawaiian interests. Just weeks before the fire, he unveiled an emergency proclamation on housing that eliminates the traditional Land Use Commission, allowing the government more leeway to build as they see fit, such as building 15-minute smart cities run by artificial intelligence, just like they've been planning to do in Hawaii for years.
At some point, I will make a major donation after all of the smoke and ashes have settled here and we figure out what the rebuilding is going to look like. This is going to be a long and difficult process. You're going to see a lot of Phoenix stories rising from the ashes here.
I want to tell you about a few of the things that I have learned during these last 5 years of intensive research. Perhaps the most startling thing that I can share with you is that all of the conspiracy theories that you've ever heard about one world government, about the UN takeover of the world, all of those conspiracies have now been laid to rest. There's nothing conspiratorial about it. It's all published. The UN-funded Commission on Global Governance began meeting in 1992 in earnest and met for 4 years and last fall released their final report. It is entitled Our Global Neighborhood. A few of the things that they wish to do. Create a world standing army under the day-to-day command of, who else? The UN Secretary General. They recommend the creation of a new Economic Security Council, into which the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the United Nations Development Program, and the World Trade Organization would all be consolidated. A unified worldwide banking scheme, currency. I don't think I need to draw any more pictures on that point. Now those non-government organizations like ours that are not accredited by the UN, we are called populist trash, activists who can destroy, they say, in a moment, years of deliberation. And you're darn right. And I have been challenged on the radio and in audiences like this, Mr. Lamb, there's no such thing as a global agenda. Hey, friend, you're absolutely wrong. Here it is. It's called Agenda 21. Agenda 21. The primary document presented in Rio de Janeiro and adopted by more than 100 heads of state, including George Bush, which lays out in intricate detail all of the transformation that must take place in society in order for it to become sustainable as they define sustainability. This may be available at the United Nations bookstore. I had to pick this up. I had not seen one until last July, had not been able to get one. I happened to be in Geneva attending a United Nations meeting, and I went to the bookstore and bought the thing. I believe it cost $45. Now, the Conference of the Parties held its first meeting in Nassau last December. At that first meeting, the United Nations Environment Program presented them with a global biodiversity assessment. Started in 1992 with a grant from the Global Environment Facility for $3.3 million, orchestrated and coordinated by the World Resources Institute and the World Wildlife Fund and the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. This is 1,140 pages that explains how to implement the 16-page treaty on biodiversity. The last 200 pages, section 13, deals specifically with a system of protected areas. It defines what a system of protected areas is. It includes core wilderness areas surrounded by buffer zones, similar to those used in the biosphere reserves, created under a UNESCO program and promoted by the United States Man in the Biosphere program. There are 382 biosphere reserves around the world, 47 of which are in the United States, not under authority of any treaty, but by voluntary agreement with the United Nations. These biosphere reserves are to be the nucleus for the core wilderness areas. Scratching my head here, what on earth is going on? And then I stumbled on page 993, and friends, if you don't think that's some heavy reading at night, page 993, after describing these protected areas, sums it all up by saying the recently published Wildlands Project in the United States is the central theme of protected areas. And on page 15 of the Wildlands Project, Dr. Reed Noss says that we must convert at least 50% of the land area of North America to wilderness, off limits to human beings. Those core wilderness areas are to be interconnected by wilderness corridors off limits to human beings. Those wilderness areas are to be surrounded by buffer zones that may have limited resource use under the supervision and permitting of the federal government, in collaboration with non-government organizations. Human population is to be resettled into the remaining 25% of the land, into communities that are described as sustainable communities. Now let me put a parenthesis right here for a moment. He created what he called a White House task force on ecosystem management. He called 20 federal departments together and said, you will create an ecosystem management policy, and you will implement the ecosystem management policy throughout the federal government, Department of Interior, Department of Agriculture, Department of Commerce, Department of Education, throughout the federal government. They developed what they called multimedia enforcement. Where they run into a problem with a community that will not accept this ecosystem management concept, multimedia enforcement means that all 20 federal agencies descend on the community and begin inspections and writing tickets. I couldn't believe it.
The document calls for literally reducing the human population by as much as 2/3 to 3/4 in the next 30 to 50 years. It could set aside up to 1/2 of the American landscape into wilderness areas interconnected by wilderness corridors, all surrounded by human buffer zones in which human activities are highly regulated. That is very, very clear in these United Nations documents that they want to set up a regulatory structure that would affect every man, woman, and child on planet Earth, and all of the control would be headquartered in the United Nations. And if we take the more recent United Nations documents, it's going to be called the Trusteeship Council in the restructure of the United Nations that's occurring right now. And the Man in the Biosphere Program, as revealed in the U.S. State Department documents as well as UNESCO documents, clearly show that the Man in the Biosphere Program actually is the first step in implementing the Convention on Biological Diversity. And there are 47 of these Man in the Biosphere programs around this nation that occupy about 51 million acres of U.S. soil.
World Heritage Sites are many of our national parks. In fact, 68% of our national parks land base is now under UNESCO's World Heritage Site. And that includes the symbol of independence in America, the Independence Hall, the Statue of Liberty, Yellowstone National Park, Monticello, Carlsbad Caverns, and the American people didn't even realize this was happening. It was done in secret.
תחשבו, אתם מפגרים? אתם מוכנים שעשו לכם